Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for the 8th lecture in the University of Regina's 2021 Research with Impact series. I'm so glad so many of you have joined us today on this unusually mild but windy and possibly snowy November day. My name is Lisa Mitchell. I'm the Associate Vice President of University Advancement and Communications at the University of Regina, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. Over the next hour, you'll hear from our President and Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Jacob and Maddie, who will present his lecture, Continuity or Change, Women and the Second World War. Before I officially introduce Dr. Keshen, though, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered virtually on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories. These are the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis, on whose territories the University of Regina's campuses reside. The University of Regina's Alumni Department, together with the Lifelong Learning Center, is once again very pleased to offer this year's Research with Impact series virtually. In 2020, we moved to the virtual format, and it has allowed us to reach alumni and friends from outside of Regina, enabling many more within the University of Regina family to take in these series. This will be the final presentation of the series in 2021, before the series continues in the new year. The details for the next series and other future events will be posted on the alumni page. And I'm looking forward today to hearing from Dr. Keshen, and I hope that your time with us inspires you to join us for new Research with Impact lectures in 2022. Please be a regular visitor to the alumni website and monitor our social media accounts for more details about opportunities to engage with us in the coming weeks and for the details on the next lecture series. I'd also like to take a moment to remind you that these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the U of R alumni website so that you can rewatch this presentation or share it with others that you think may be interested. You'll see the link to the alumni website in the chat. If you'd like to access this video later or peruse past presentations, just click on that link or save that link to your web browser, and that'll take you right to the presentations going forward. Today, we intend to wrap up by 1 p.m. to allow you to get on with your day. Dr. Keshen will finish his presentation by about 12:45 or 12:50, still allowing for some time for questions. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our 8th speaker in the Research with Impact series, our President and Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Jacob and Maddie. Dr. Keshen holds a doctoral degree from York University with a research concentration in the history of war and conflict. He has served as the chair of the Department of History at the University of Ottawa and was an adjunct professor in the Center of Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. Dr. Keshen is the author of 5 books, more than 25 scholarly articles, and has edited 11 books. He's a busy guy. His book, Propaganda and Censorship in the Canadian Great War, was awarded Best Nonfiction Book by the Writers Guild of Alberta and was shortlisted for the Humanities and Social Sciences Federation of Canada's Harold Adams Innis Prize for the best book in the social sciences. His book, Saints, Sinners and Soldiers, Canada's Second World War, was shortlisted for the Raymond Klibansky Prize for the best book in the humanities, a prize awarded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Federation of Canada. Today, Dr. Keshen will present Continuity or Change, Canadian Women and the Second World War. Now, over the course of the Second World War, more than 1 million Canadian women joined the wartime workforce, often in positions that had previously been the exclusive domain of men, and some 50,000 enlisted in auxiliary services of Canada's 3 military branches. In the summer of 1943, nearly 4 years into Canada's participation in the Second World War, Mary Etta McPherson, who had taken over as editor of Chatelaine, Canada's most widely circulated women's magazine, wrote, "We hope some of those bright college girls, soon to troop back for the fall term, will write a thesis on what war has done to improve the lot of Canadian women." Academic debate has centered on the degree to which these new and typically temporary trends precipitated longer-term change towards gender equity, a question Dr. Keshen's presentation will contextualize and seek to answer. Following Dr. Keshen's presentation, boy, there's a lot of shows there. Sorry, Dr. Keshen. We'll have about 15 minutes for a question and answer session, and Hertha from the Lifelong Learning Center will be moderating the question and answers. Now, as you listen to Dr. Keshen's presentation, please put your questions in the Zoom chat feature. It's the little kind of word bubble or chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. And Hertha will take those questions and share them with Dr. Keshen after his presentation, and we'll do our very best to get to as many questions as time allows. And so now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Keshen so he can do his presentation. Welcome.
Oh, thanks a lot, Lisa. I guess that I'm the person who answered Mary McPherson's. So I didn't write the dissertation, but I wrote a book which is part of larger question on the way that social change occurred in World War II. So thanks so much for the opportunity to present some of my scholarly work. It's a little bit older, but nevertheless, I still think it's relevant and of interest to people about this question of Canadian women in the Second World War. And I also want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories, the Cree, the Saulteaux, and Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. And today, these lands continue to share a territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. I selected a topic today that I hope will be of interest, the debate regarding the impact of the Second World War on Canadian women. It's hard to believe that we're really almost coming up to, I guess, coming to a century, and there's very few survivors of that war. My dad was part of that war, and it's hard to believe that if he was alive today, he would be nearly 100 years old. And what I look at is the extent to which the war really advanced the trajectory towards equality. This is not my most current work, but I thought it would be more engaging than more recent publications on what I've been looking at, which is the expansion of the federal government authority and finances during the First World War. I thought, maybe not that good. Or the history of the Calgary-based military museums. We're in Regina right now. Or what I hope to complete over the next couple of years, which Dr. Stephen King is aware of, who I know is in this audience today. It relates to my former position, and that was a history, or that will be a history of Memorial University's Grenfell campus, which in 2025, a year after us here, will also be celebrating its 50th anniversary. So Lisa turned to the first part, and Mary McPherson, I found that quote really interesting. She was editor of Chatelaine, which was then Canada's most widely circulated women's magazine. And she wrote about what a thesis on what the war had done to improve the lot of Canadian women. Although it remained unknown whether any college women took up McPherson's challenge back in '43, her question has attracted and continues to attract scholarly interest. Actually, on both sides of the border, the same debate occurs in the United States with authors like Sherna Gluck and Susan Hartman, and over in Britain, the same debate. Pearson's, the title of Ruth Pearson's book, which is probably around 30 or 40 years now, sort of indicates where a lot of Canadian scholars have landed on this. And it's called They're Still Women After All. They're Still Women After All. And Pearson argues that the persistence of gender-based stereotypes and discriminatory government policies, in fact, permitted only relatively minor breakthroughs for women during the war, and that these advances were by and large reversed once the troops came home. My conclusion, however, is a little bit different. It's that, like all historical questions involving numerous issues and actors, the patterns are never neat and tidy, but rather like the complex society in which they occurred, like our society today, they're kind of chaotic and at times contradictory. Canadian women were initially asked to contribute to the war effort through volunteer work. Rarely was this perceived as a challenge to male authority, for it was unpaid, it tapped into the supposedly self-sacrificing nature of women, and it mainly involved projects that reflected their traditional domestic tasks or mothering duties like knitting. I know that a lot of people are aware that women did this during both the First and the Second World War, and preparing and serving food in military canteens. Still, recognizing the indispensable role played by females in the voluntary sector, in the autumn of 1940, year after the war begins, the federal government created a Women's Voluntary Services Division. Ultimately, it established 44 female-run branches across Canada to better promote and to coordinate the wide variety of patriotic efforts undertaken by women's groups. The many women who worked under these leaders of these sometimes extensive operations also derived pride and a sense of importance from activities that were heralded as being of critical importance to the war effort. This was especially so since praise issued from influential sources like political platforms, church pulpits, radio and film, newspapers, and magazines. Account after account lauded the dedication, the strength of women volunteers, many of whom they pointed out donated their time to multiple campaigns or performed physically taxing tasks, such as the work of thousands of young women who participated in the farm labor programs. Important changes were also occurring in the wartime household, an even more traditional venue than the voluntary sector. Women assumed greater responsibilities, and especially when the head of a family enlisted, they became the chief authority figure. Now, with some concern, one psychologist at the time wrote that as women were growing accustomed to making all the decisions, maybe they would prove less willing to give up authority when the family was united again. Putting a different spin on it, a female Canadian social worker writing in Chatelaine expressed the hope that such decision-making patterns would in peacetime allow a greater number of housewives to enjoy a more equal partnership in marriage. Now, despite the significant and much heralded efforts of women volunteers or their proficiency in overcoming new obstacles in the domestic sphere, however, the voluntary and domestic settings are rarely cited by scholars as origins for major and lasting challenges to the then traditional gendered order. Rather, both during and after the war, nearly all analyses, whatever their conclusions, suggest that the most meaningful advances for civilian women were achieved within male-dominated domains from which substantial economic and social mobility and status and power flow, namely higher education and especially the paid workforce. Now, with the departure of enlisted men, women came to constitute a large proportion of the student body. By 1945, the last year of the war, 28.6% of all undergraduate degrees in Canada were conferred upon women. That's an increase from 21.3% at the beginning of the war. Now, studies in arts continue to attract most women, but the number of Bachelor of Science degrees granted to women increased nationally. Now, we're not talking about large numbers of university students at this time, but from 51 in 1941 to 90 in 1945, or from 14.9% to 20.6% of the national total. Well, 25 women graduated as doctors in 1941, representing 4.4% of the total. By 1946, the year after the war ends, these numbers had reached 45 and 7.9% respectively. Women university graduates also had greater opportunities to secure rewarding employment during the war. Marriage still claims many, wrote the Ottawa Journal, but in the nation's capital, for example, arts graduates were being scooped up by an expanding civil service, and by no means only for entry-level positions, while those with scientific or technical knowledge frequently received offers from such institutions as the National Research Council, or as in communities across the land, from numerous industries involved in war production. The movement of women university graduates to higher level jobs was but one aspect of the mass migration of women into the paid labor market and an unprecedented array of jobs. Between June 1939 and the beginning of 1944, some 370,000 women obtained employment in domains directly connected to the war effort, and the number of women with jobs outside the home totaled some 1.35 million, growing from 22.7 to 33.1% of the eligible female population to work 14 and older. Record numbers of working women were married and they had children. By mid-1942, the need for wartime labor prompted the federal government to institute income tax breaks for working couples, and legislation was passed promising state-run and subsidized childcare. Still, despite the movement of women into new social roles, much of the public commentary, much of the public discourse at the time attempted to reassure people that very little was in fact changing. This message was delivered by numerous sources, including companies that saw new business opportunities in the needs of working women. Playing upon the theme of women's stereotyped ornamental qualities, the makers of cosmetics and other personal hygiene products advertised that no matter the roughness of the job being performed, their product would help maintain a woman's beauty and her traditional femininity. Press commentary was more likely to take the reassuring stance that women workers had taken jobs solely out of patriotism to release more men for action, and they would happily return home once victory was attained. Work after the war? Not if she doesn't have to. She'd like to get married, was the message of one article in the December 1942 edition of Saturday Night Magazine. To make industrial jobs seem more natural and less threatening to women, or to make such work seem more palatable, several articles compared their new tasks to housework. For example, the large lathes with which some women work were likened, public commentary, to sewing machines. Bit of a stretch, but this is what was said. As well as conveying restrictive stereotypes about women, however, many news stories and editorials, on the other hand, gave inspirational accounts of female strength and skill in numerous and unprecedented roles outside of the domestic sphere. For instance, in June 1942, a Maclean's magazine feature on women aircraft workers, who at their peak numbers made up 30% of the national total in that sector, stressed their pride in the positions they held and the efficiency and the skill with which they performed their tasks. Perhaps the most optimistic with respect to the consequences of women's new wartime work was Lotta Dempsey, Chatelain's future editor-in-chief, then probably its most prominent columnist, and among wartime female journalists, certainly one of its most outspoken feminists. In a 1943 article, she declared, "This was the time and the place it really started. The honest to goodness equality of Canadian women began to happen that hour when Canadian girls," she uses that term, "left desks and kitchens, stepped into overalls, and took their places in the lines of workers at lathes and drills." Women workers were also the subject of several multi-page newspaper and magazine features that showed photographs of them operating heavy and sometimes massive machinery. "There's no picking of soft jobs or shifts for women," read one account, paraphrasing a grizzled foreman in an unnamed shipyard. In making his point, the foreman directed attention to a woman operating a massive crane to lower a large gun onto a ship. "She does the job as well as he does, and with less fuss and swearing," he remarked. "If they want to stay after the war, I don't see why they shouldn't." Newsreels and documentaries from Canada's new National Film Board, that's when it started in the Second World War, featured the work-related activities of civilian women. Some of these films reiterated the theme that women had entered wartime jobs solely out of patriotism and were anticipating their eventual return home. But many other movies, as propaganda, detailed and they celebrated women's workplace contributions, in part to encourage yet greater participation and output. In 1942, the NFB made Women Are Warriors. Its director was Jane Marsh, one of the few women that the NFB hired in this capacity. It reviewed the many new and impressive civilian jobs performed by females in various allied countries. At a British airplane factory, for example, the male narrator talks about women adapting themselves easily to tasks that included working on electrical circuits, soldering iron, working with drills and lathes, and riveting sheet metal. What was it, in fact, that motivated women themselves to join the wartime workforce? Many were indeed motivated by patriotism and accepted wartime work as a temporary undertaking. Polls, just the Canadian Institute of Public Opinion was just started at this time, polls show that about 70% of women supported the idea that male veterans deserve the first crack at post-war jobs, though it's interesting that such surveys never broke down the results between women who were employed and those who stayed at home. Still, it is unmistakable that over the course of the war, as more women moved into the workforce, increasing numbers of them came to desire or to seek greater opportunities, including continued employment after male repatriation. According to a March 1943 survey of female war workers in Toronto, only 9% said that they were motivated by patriotism to enter the job market, whereas 32% cited personal reasons, including loneliness and boredom, and 59% identified financial considerations. Women, and especially wives and mothers, however, met with often strong opposition to their large-scale and possibly long-term presence in the paid workforce. A 1943 petition in Quebec, which was very religious at the time, demanding that female labor at night be prohibited, as well as work for mothers with children under 16, gathered more than 120,000 names. Across the country, many employers, before hiring women who were mothers, demanded that they provide a letter from a reputable source proving that adequate childcare was being provided while they worked. Yet, the problem of high female absentee rates resulting from inadequate childcare services did become a pressing one. By the end of 1941, for example, Toronto's West End creche had a waiting list of some 700 for 150 spots. To address this matter, the federal government introduced a plan in June 1942 for a jointly funded Dominion Provincial Wartime Day Nursery Program to provide full-time care for children aged 2 to 5, the message being that women with children younger than 2 should not work, and lunchtime and after-school supervision for children 6 to 15. Still, strong public apprehension was a factor in limiting this program. The Catholic Women's League of Canada resolved that any movement which tends to separate parents from children is to be deplored. In Quebec, many French Canadians suspected government nurseries of drawing children away from their Catholic faith. It soon became evident that government-run daycare would be a small-scale venture. Ontario and Quebec, both being centers of war production, were the only provincial governments to participate in the scheme. Ontario opened 28 daycare facilities, though the nearly 1,100 spaces provided only met perhaps 20% of the need among mothers in war industry. In Quebec, only 6 facilities opened, offering just under 200 spots and solely in Montreal. At the wartime workplace, women generally found men dominating in higher prestige and higher paid jobs and virtually monopolizing positions of authority. During the war, the average annual salary for men increased from about $1,000 to $1,700 as more high-paying jobs opened up, and the average work week increased from 47 to 49 hours. It was wartime, people pitched in. Although some women did well financially, the average annual pay among women went from just under $600 to $1,000, a marginal improvement of 56 to 59% of the male rate. Nonetheless, it was common for women workers, both during and after the war, to speak of their growing pride, their growing confidence from having coped with long hours and physically demanding tasks, from successfully performing what was called men's work, and often from earning the respect of many male co-workers. One said that her work at the Montreal Crown Corporation, Defense Industries Limited, precipitated a whole social and emotional evolution that made her more ambitious and worldly wise. Many women, especially those with spouses, emphasized the satisfaction they gained from feeling more self-sufficient. It was a tremendous thing to earn your own money, said a married woman who had worked in the Vancouver shipyards. Another, formerly with the Ottawa Car Manufacturing Company, which had converted during the war to aircraft production, spoke of her job in terms of buying self-respect. Numerous media accounts reflected these attitudes. Growing accustomed to the economic independence at a higher wage than she has ever before been permitted to enjoy, will she in future be content to live on an average man's salary? Rhetorically inquired Saturday night columnist Dorothy Norwich in December 1942. A 1945 survey taken by a large but unnamed trade union of approximately 1,000 female industrial workers revealed that if given the choice, 80% of the married, 95% of the single, and 100% of the widowed women would continue working at their job after the war. As the Axis powers collapsed, however, public commentary intensified its recommendation that women prepare to leave the job market. Women were told to put the needs of veterans first and to show unyielding support and patience in order to speed their reintegration into civilian and family life. No protection was extended to women as large sections of the private sector revamped the gender composition of their workforce to its pre-war disposition. The results, they're telling. Canada's female participation rate in the paid employment market plunged from its 1944 peak of 33.1% to a 1946 level of just 25%. Now, it would be certainly a gross misrepresentation to imply that all working women who returned to domesticity were forced back home. Many accepted the message that their employment had been an emergency wartime measure. Some women had come to loathe their wartime jobs. One female war worker at Dominion Rubber in Montreal remembered the dust, dirt, and stench that pervaded the plant and insisted that anyone in their right mind would have wanted to leave. Many were exhausted after years of what we call the double day. They worked and they took care of the home, and they yearned for an easier and, they hoped, more stable and tranquil life. Women with children felt guilty, or they were made to feel guilty for not spending more time at home. The impulse to home and to family, which was also the desire of countless servicemen after years away, was indicated by a marriage rate that rose from 9 per 1,000 in 1945 to 11 the following year, and by a fertility rate per 1,000 women that climbed from 24 per 1,000 in 1945 to a post-war peak of 29 in 1947, ushering the period that we all know is called the baby boom. Now, the popular view of the initial post-war years is that things by and large settled down into traditional patriarchal order. This trend was helped considerably by a buoyant job market and low inflation, which made it more possible for single-income families to be economically comfortable. Also, with reason, the picture that still prevails from those years is of an image of mass migration to suburbia into new communities filled with affordable housing, then viewed as ideal for raising families because of their wide open space and neighborhoods brimming with young couples and children. This image also included the stay-at-home wife who devoted herself to supporting her husband's career and raising her family. But millions of Canadian women did not live in suburbia. They were not middle class and needed to work for a living. This is not to dismiss the widespread resistance towards this trend. Indeed, it is important to remember that it took a generation after the end of World War II, for Canada's female job participation rate to reach its 1944 peak. Still, throughout the late 1940s, the average aggregate number of women in the paid workforce remained higher than until 1943, and the participation rate, especially in non-agricultural fields, slightly greater than at the outset of the decade. More telling is that set against the image of the post-war stay-at-home wife was the contrasting fact that the total number of married women in Canada's employment market rose from 85,600 in 1941 to 349,000 in 1951. Now, it is true that low-paid female job ghettos persisted. For instance, in 1951, 96.4% of stenographers and typists were women. That year, when male laborers earned approximately $2,500 annually, about half of women in the clerical sector earned less than $1,500. Also, men typically made more for doing exactly the same job, approximately 50% greater than the pay received by women. Still, I would argue that ongoing inequities do not negate the reality of changes that, in the context of the times, were regarded as constituting significant progress for women, and which several sources traced to breakthroughs achieved during World War II. Commenting in 1950 on the increasing number of women in the paid workforce, the federal government's publication, the Labour Gazette, referred particularly to the Second World War, when they came through, it was said, with flying colors. 4 years later, the same source asserted that the employment situation for women today is very much different. Marital status alone is apparently no longer sufficient to prevent them from entering employment, as it was in most instances back in 1939. The Second World War not only brought unprecedented numbers of Canadian women to the paid labor market, but also for the first time, a notable presence in the military. Nearly 4,500 served as military nurses, though this did not bring controversy. Such women were still often portrayed in terms that effectively denied their professionalism. For instance, one extreme is what historian Catherine McPherson dubbed the asexual saint, whose image shone forth from the cover of the October 1940 edition of the magazine The Canadian Home Journal in the guise of an army nurse in double-breasted tunic, white square-cut apron, and white nun-like dress. Although Canadian military nurses confronted highly stressful and harrowing situations and often functioned close to the line of fire, they received comparatively little attention in Canadian government propaganda and the mass media. Why? This was largely because their presence raised relatively few concerns, as they could still remain comfortably ensconced within traditional gender constructions. Attention was primarily focused on the fact that the Canadian government had, for the first time, officially sanctioned the creation of other women warriors. On the 27th of June, 1941, the federal government announced the creation of the Canadian Women's Army Corps, the CWACs, or what is colloquially known as the Quacks, whose numbers ultimately reached 21,600. On 2nd of July, 1941, Charles Power, Canada's Air Minister, announced the formation of the Canadian Women's Air Auxiliary Service. The following February, it was renamed the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, or the RCFWDs, and its numbers eventually reached about 17,000. Finally, as the German Navy had become a major presence in the Northwestern Atlantic by January 1942, thus necessitating a greater military presence and administrative staff at Canadian ports, the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, or WRENS, followed suit on the 31st of July, 1942, and they reached about 7,000. Government propaganda strongly emphasized that the employment of women in the military was a temporary emergency measure. Such publicity also assured Canadians that precautions were in place to prevent, even in the rough military world, femininity from being compromised, either in terms of women's appearance or the supposedly higher moral standards that govern their conduct. Initially, women who enlisted earned 2/3 of the male pay rate, the principal justification being that they were kept out of combat. Women with children were barred from military service, whether or not the husband was at home. When asked in 1942 how women could best help the war effort, just 7% of Canadians polled identified military service. Also, a March 1943 poll revealed that only 58% of Canadians and just 43% of Quebecers thought that a woman who wore a military uniform would not restrict her chances at marriage. Many believed that such women would be considered too masculine, unattractive for marriage, sexually loose because they were drawn into an overwhelmingly male environment, or worse yet, as a whispering campaign took hold, were lesbians seeking out trysts among their comrades. Among recruitment material released by the RCFWDs was the reassuring message that Canadian mothers can cease worrying about their daughters, because the moment they enlist, the reason being that their sergeant acts as a second mother. Yet, besides trying to reassure worried citizens that women would be little altered by military service, government propaganda also had to directly target potential recruits who had many other choices in a burgeoning civilian job market. Recruiting material would actually typically downplay jobs such as clerking, cleaning, and cooking, and instead showed women undertaking glamorous assignments, such as in the case of the RCFWDs, logging Air Force flights and dispatching secret teletype messages. What of the women themselves? Why did they join up? What treatment did they encounter? How did they come to regard their military service? Well, surveys taken in 1943 found that about 40% of those who enlisted were inspired by patriotism. A number of women sought to emulate a male family member in uniform. Others enlisted because there was no man to uphold the family name. And yet others sought in some way to avenge the death of a loved one at the hands of the enemy. About 1/3 of respondents indicated their desire for adventure, greater independence, and escape from civilian routines. The survey also revealed that the prestige associated with the military uniform motivated 13% to enlist, while just 12% specified the goal of releasing more men for active service. Although some women hoped to perform the same wartime duties as men, they constituted a minority. One was Molly Beale, an expert civilian pilot from Edmonton, who was eventually inducted into the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame. But as a member of the WDs, the RCAF, she was denied her request to take to the sky like her brother. Ultimately, air women gained access to about 65 of 102 possible Air Force trades, but this did not include pilot, navigator, gunner, or bombardier. Meanwhile, as of March 1945, 62% of the CWAC personnel were clerks, 8% were cooks, and with the addition of other assignments reflecting traditional female civilian jobs, such as storewoman, switchboard operator, postal sorter, and dental assistant, the total rises to 87%. Surveys among service women indicated that the least preferred jobs were cooks and laundry workers, postings to which, however, only about 20% of women were assigned. Administrative positions, the most commonly given to women, were viewed much more positively, being regarded as in civilian life as white-collar work being of higher prestige. One survey of the CWAC recruits identified about 1/3 of women indicating this type of work as their first preference. Many had performed such jobs before the war and realized they could provide valuable experience in preparation for obtaining post-war employment. Government propaganda and press accounts undoubtedly inflated the numbers of women performing high prestige jobs, though this exaggeration likely raised the public's perception of service women. As more men went overseas, a greater array of opportunities did open up to women in uniform. When the CWAC started, some 30 trades were listed for women, but by the end of the war, the number had reached 55, including posts such as dropsman, mechanic, and technician. Several of the 65 trades that opened up to members of the RCFWDs, which initially signed women to just 8, required considerable preparation that gave graduates exceptional, valuable skills, such as in the case of a 3-month course to qualify as a photographic technician. Air women dominated the information handling trades, which often involved the use of coded and top secret material, employment to which many attributed considerable status. Besides widening the parameters of their participation, service women also eventually acquired a better financial deal. Most accepted some pay differential with men, largely on the basis that, as one former CWAC member said, they were required to kill and we weren't. Still, soon after the auxiliary services were established and servicewomen demonstrated their competence in several domains, support grew both among women in uniform and in organizations like the National Council of Women of Canada for equal pay in cases where women perform exactly the same job as men. However, more significant in seizing the attention of military and government authorities was the increasing difficulty in recruiting women, given the availability and the increasing availability of decently paid civilian jobs. In July 1943, the basic pay for females in the military was raised to 80% from 2/3 of the male pay rate, while rates obtained for qualifying for a military trade were provided on an equal basis with men. Despite discrimination and disappointments, most servicewomen said that they found military life agreeable. Unit morale reports, government did this, they looked at the units, they took surveys among military units, show expressions of disenchantment being overshadowed by the satisfaction gained from broadening perspectives, learning to cope with difficult tasks, developing greater self-discipline, and making lifelong friends. Yet, by the time Canadian soldiers set foot in continental Europe with D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, plans were already underway to disband the 3 female military auxiliaries. Only the nursing corps was kept in peacetime. Both the federal government and the military rejected the idea of maintaining a skeleton crew of CWACs, WDs, and RENs. Reflecting much of the popular discourse, one article in the Ottawa Journal asserted that service women look forward to, as it said, getting married and having lots of babies. However, just as the popular image of civilian working women heading back into the domestic sphere has its ambivalence, the return to peacetime was also not so straightforward with service women. Rita McLean-Farquharson, the Canadian Home Journal's associate editor, said that though many service women being discharged dreamed of a man, a home, and a baby, they had also become more independent and would not wait with bated breath for a Prince Charming to come riding by. Some military reports indicated that women in uniform would not easily accept the role of the demure and dependent spouse. This message was strongly suggested, for example, in a May 1945 survey by the Army's Research and Information Section of some 1,000 CWAC members as their intentions following demobilization. Among those who were single, 31% wanted to get married as soon as possible. However, 21% either desired or would consider joining the peacetime military, 15% talked of attending university, and 33% put paid work or vocational training as their top priority. Now, rather than taking advantage of retraining or education programs offered by the new Department of Veterans Affairs, or DVA, about 70% of women veterans claimed, in addition to a military gratuity, it's a cash payment based on your length of military service, a matching reestablishment credit in addition to that gratuity. Among permissible expenditures for the reestablishment credit was the purchase, repair, renovation, or furnishing of a home. A woman who had served in the Western Hemisphere for about 2 years could collect about $400, which is approximately equal to the expected down payment for then a small house. While some servicewomen pursued this option to help settle into domestic life, many others, as self-supporting single women, joined the job market. Their prospects were often brightened by the skills they had learned or enhanced while in uniform. For example, Jean Geldart's wartime job with the RCAF's fingerprinting section landed her post-war employment with the RCMP, and a life that, she pointed out, contrasted sharply with that of most of the young women she left behind in St. Stephen's, New Brunswick, who had spent the war and many years afterwards, she said, working for a pittance in the local cotton mill. Many ex-servicewomen found themselves stymied as better paying and higher prestige job went to male veterans who were considered to have made greater sacrifices and for whom, as current or future breadwinners, it was said, good salaries were deemed most essential. However, In several cases, government policies actually worked against sending ex-service women down a path to the household kitchen. In January 1942, under the auspices of a government subcommittee on demobilization and rehabilitation, Ottawa established another committee to plan for what it called as the special problems of discharged servicewomen. Its recommendations, designed in large part to attract more female recruits at the time, remember this is 1942, served as the basis for steady improvements for women in accessing veterans benefits. By the time the DVA was created in March 1944, females enjoyed, at least on paper, pretty much the same treatment as men under the various DVA programs. When it came to their actual administration, however, DVA counselors, who were mostly male, typically tried to steer married women to domestic life, and most of the others into a set of job options which were perceived as female. For instance, only 147 women, or 0.5% of the total number approved, received grants and low-interest loans under the Veterans Land Act to start farming operations. Although some 7,000 servicewomen took advantage of DVA retraining opportunities, most of the courses in which they were enrolled were comparatively short and channeled them into less lucrative, traditionally female fields. For example, over 3,000 qualified as stenographers and typists, and nearly 1,500 as hairdressers and beauticians. It would be misleading, however, to suggest that women veterans were simply victims of DVA counselors and administrators who were determined to ensure male dominance in the workplace. When women veterans were asked about their preferences for vocational training before meeting with the DVA counselor, according to a 1945 survey taken among personnel with 100 CWAC units, 85% of them indicated commercial courses, hairdressing, dressmaking, and nursing. The fact is that many women were making a practical and strategic choice in selecting such options, believing that employment prospects for females in non-traditional fields were not as bright. A number also felt most comfortable in doing such jobs, especially since they'd often performed them well in the military. However, with thousands of women taking advantage of government retraining programs, the number of exceptions to the typical gendered pattern grew, thus making female participation in a wider spectrum of jobs less unusual and presumably providing more inspiration for other women. All told, ex-service women took training for 85 occupations, which included journalism, printing, commercial art and photography, as well as for various mechanical, laboratory, and technical posts. Also with DVA funding, some 3,000 ex-service women attended university at percentages comparable to rates among male veterans. Just under half were in arts programs, and when other domains traditionally accessed by women, social work, household science was called at the time or factored in, it rises to about 80%. Still, for numerous ex-service women, university education represented, in the words of a former airwoman, a chance most of us would never have dreamed of in those Depression pre-war years. Moreover, as U.S. historian Susan Hartman writes, any movement further unlocking the doors of higher education to women created a larger pool of women with a vision of life beyond domesticity and the subordinate. For instance, while the number of Canadian women graduating as doctors in 1944 was 35, or 4.8% of the total, by 1948 it was 54, or 8.3%. So to sum up, for Canadian women, both during and after the war, dichotomies prevailed, reflecting what was a controversial, complex, sometimes contradictory process of historical change. And even if the changes encouraged by World War II proved small, when measured against the gender-based inequities that persisted after the war, I think it's still important to underline the fact that three-quarters of a century ago, transformations such as the growing permanent presence of working wives and women in a wider array of military roles represented notable breakthroughs for females. In accessing the impact of the war upon her generation, a former woman war worker turned to the cliche, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, an aphorism that I believe represents this and countless other junctures that arguably accelerated social change. So my thanks to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Keshen. Some very interesting information, and despite the inequities that still exist and need to be addressed, I, for one, am very, very grateful to these pioneering women for enabling me to be a part of the workforce. So, Hertha, I'm assuming that we have some questions. I saw a couple come up in the chat, so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Okay, I got one from Mark. So how possible was it for women with children to be financially stable on a salary of an enlisted husband? Did they depend on other family to survive? Example, did they have to work to survive financially?
So women in the Second World War, like the First World War. First World War, women with a husband in the military received funds from received some money from the Canadian Patriotic Fund. It wasn't very much, and by the end of the war, government was providing the basis for what was called the dependence allowance. That was instituted as a government allowance in the Second World War, and it could be supplemented as well if you had children. Some women with family support were able to survive on this. Many found it inadequate, so it would depend upon the family situation whether or not the dependence allowance and the supplement from the Dependence Board of Trustees would provide enough money. It depended also on the number of children that you had. And I guess we could say in some aspects, I know that Dr. Raymond Blake, I can see him here. I guess you could say that this also is the same sort of thing with the family allowances, the baby boom, which Dr. Blake has written about after the war. So I think it depends on the family situation.
Okay, another one from Milan. How were women widowed in the war perceived in the workplace? Were they generally accepted?
Yes, I think among women in the workplace, those who were widowed would be the most accepted. The most controversial in the workplace were women with children. Married women with someone overseas, I think, had less of an issue. But there was a lot of concern about women, for example, working, if they had a husband, working at night, concerns about the moral regulation of women. But women with children were most controversial, not those who were widowed. And there was concern with women in the workforce, particularly with teenage children, about neglect of children and rising juvenile delinquency. I believe that was very much exaggerated. There's a whole number of reasons for that. With your most crime-inclined demographic group overseas, which is 18 to 30-year-old males, rates among minor crimes among juveniles went up, but it was a moral panic that occurred during wartime. And there was also concerns about child neglect in wartime as well. There were terms used like car babies, where it was crazy that people used this, but they would say that women workers, some of them who were neglectful, would be leaving their children in cars in the parking lot and going to work during the day, or what they would call latchkey children. And some of you may have heard of that term as well, where the child would come home on their own, a young child that feed themselves at lunchtime, be wearing as a necklace the latchkey to the house. So generally speaking, war widows would have been most understood as being in the workforce, and greater controversy with the dependents that you would have in the family.
And I just got a comment from Kathleen Entrabus. There's a National Film Board movie called Rosie the Riveteer, a World War II documentary. Well worth seeing, she says.
Yes,
that's it. I don't.
Rosie the Riveter is American, and we had our own version of in some magazines of the same representation of the strong female factory worker during war with the bandana over their head. But Rosie was an American creation.
And I don't have any more questions. Oh, this way. Wanda, from Wanda. How do you think the war effort influenced or didn't the decisions of women to pursue post-secondary education?
I would answer this several ways. I think that it certainly did open up and set the examples for not just the women themselves, but for their daughters. Sherna Gluck did an oral history of women in wartime. And what she discovered was that if you look generationally for these women who were in the workforce in the 1940s, their daughters came to age in the 1960s and took in many cases the lessons, frustrations, and aspirations of their mothers to have greater ambitions. The other thing that I would say, it's not just women. It's the Canadian university system opens up tremendously with 40,000 veterans, both male and female, coming into universities after the war. prior to the war, about, depending on, you'd have about 5% of the Canadian population that would attend universities. The examples of veterans pouring into universities opened up those institutions to a much wider population, created social mobility, and set the examples for others would follow. Universities weren't prepared to deal with this influx. Scarborough campus at U of T started in a former munitions plant. University of Alberta, again, massive temporary construction that occurred, classes that were jam-packed. But I think that the war, World War II, really was the basis for transforming Canadian universities, just as it was, as some of the people on this, historians would know, that it really does set the stage in so many respects for the social policy that we have in Canada. Unemployment insurance, a larger role of the federal government, because it was many of the things that were undertaken were based upon the things that didn't occur after the First World War and the disillusionment that occurred among veterans and the backlash that occurred, that things went back to exactly what they were after the First World War. So I think that the Second World War accelerated social trends because of the fact that they learned so many of the lessons of the First World War, and many that were making social policy in the Second World War, like Robert England and Walter Woods, who were instrumental in establishing veterans policy, the Veterans Charter, were World War I veterans, and they saw firsthand the failings of what happened after that war, and corrected in everything from university education to the Veterans Land Act compared to the old Soldier Settlement Board. So I think that's why World War II is so transformational, including with Canada's first universal social program, which is the family allowances or the baby bonus.
And from Lori, thanks for including Canada's nursing sisters in your presentation. And from Zaya Jai, thank you, Dr. Keshen, for presenting for such a fascinating research and presentation. In your scholarly work, have you come upon any data relating to how opportunities for women of color in Canada were opened up or not as a result of the wars?
Unfortunately, it is still a very racist society at that time, and not just for women of color who still face segregation, but also for Indigenous population, which did not get the same access to many of those programs as white Canadians or European Canadians. The reality was that those things still took some time to change. Bear in mind that we're talking about a country that as late as 1962 still had in its Immigration Act climatic adaptability as one of the criteria for entry into Canada, which really excluded people from southern or countries that we would consider populated by racialized groups. So it was not equal by any means.
And Paula says, thank you for this enlightening presentation and for presenting it through Zoom for those of us outside the city.
Thank you.
And from Osfeed, I'm sorry if I can't pronounce your name, it is important to note as well that Canadian women served and flew in the service known as the Air Transport Auxiliary in the UK. They delivered aircraft from factories to frontline squadrons. This is covered in an anthology series, Flying Under Fire, a book series definitely worth checking out. And from Stephen King, did women who served in the auxiliary forces receive equivalent pensions to those received post-war by men who served in the active forces?
Sorry, Stephen. So they would have received the equivalent gratuities based upon where they served. So very few women. So it's in 3 stages, the gratuity: time spent in Canada, time in sort of a secondary area, which would include England, and then time in active service. So men who would have been in active service for each month there would have received a higher gratuity. So actually, some of the guys coming out, if they enlisted in 39, went over to England in 1940, and then worked for maybe been in the invasion of Sicily in 43, and then came and went into Northwest Europe and then were there to the end of the war and afterwards, they would have collected certainly enough to purchase with the reestablishment credit. They would have had half a house. But few women got overseas.
I don't have any more questions.
Thank you so much, Hertha, for facilitating the questions. Dr. Keshen, I do have one last question, and I think we have maybe just a minute for you to respond to it. You mentioned through your presentation that the disparities between salaries, we know today that still exists to some degree. We know today that there isn't equal representation, often at boards of women and men. What do you think it's going to take in the next number of years to get us to a point where equality truly does exist?
I think active measures to hire people in those positions. That's, I believe, you have to take proactive measures to increase the numbers. I think that's happened in many instances, many areas. If you think about in the United States, we know, I don't think we talk about affirmative action as much as what it was in the years that I was growing up, because now it's quite natural that we have far more people, African Americans, in positions of greater responsibility, authority, power, whatever term you want. So I think it's going to take that to expedite the change.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Hertha, and thank you to everyone joining us today and to for you contributing to the conversation and the presentation that Dr. Keshen made. And many thanks to you, Dr. Keshen, for sharing your thoughts and your research with us on this fascinating topic. A video of today's Research with Impact lecture will be posted soon on the alumni section of our website. A link to our website can be found in the chat. I think that's been posted, and they may post it again. And you can feel free to share that link with your family and friends if others are interested in the material that Dr. Keshen shared this morning or this afternoon. Also, please don't forget to check the University of Regina website for information on lectures in this series and more that are to come. And as mentioned earlier, the U of R's Research with Impact series will continue after the holiday season in the new year. Please stay tuned for more information about this, which will be made available through the University of Regina Alumni Association webpage, as well as through our social channels. I want to thank you once again to everyone here for taking the time to join us for this presentation of Research with Impact today. And again, many thanks to you, Dr. Keshen, for taking the time out of your schedule, and wishing all of you on the call today the opportunity to stay safe and warm, and maybe stay in one place. It looks like the wind is picking up outside, and to have a great day and a great rest of your week. All the best. Take care.
Thank you.